If every young politician needs a mentor, Charles H. Grosvenor served as a mentor to George T. Drake. Known popularly as the Old Lion of Athens, Grosvenor was born in Connecticut in 1833 and died in Athens in October 1917. He left the Union Army a brigadier general and thereafter was called General Grosvenor by all who dealt with him. He was in Congress from 1891 until 1911. He lived in a sprawling home in Athens, bordering what is now the Ohio University campus. His political activity was centered there and in the local courthouse. He earned a reputation for extraordinary accuracy in predicting congressional votes and in delivering elections. It was General Grosvenor who gave the 26-year-old George Drake his postmastership in May of 1897. George served 8 years, 2 consecutive terms, and resigned when he was elected Perry County Auditor in 1905. Note in this clipping that he has been recommended by General Grosvenor as postmaster of Corning, Ohio. The more important that George Drake became in Perry County politics, the more he and the general corresponded. Here is the general's handwritten postscript to a letter of November 1905 to George Drake. It reads, "Can you come down here next Tuesday and see me? I want to get you to do something for me, and I want to see you and arrange it. Telephone on Tuesday what train you will come down on. Truly, C. H. Grosvenor." This was obviously private political business that the general did not want to commit to paper nor even to discuss on the telephone. Among the many other letters between the general and his young charge was this one, December 19, 1904, from Athens, Ohio. "I am put to the necessity of annoying you again," the faded letter says. "Will you come down here tomorrow, if possible, on the first train? Come right to the courthouse, and I will meet you so that you can go straight back on the 3:36 train. I want to have a talk with you, and it is highly important that I should." As county auditor, George T. Drake enjoyed what seems in retrospect almost unbelievable press, whether measured in terms of column inches or in the positive endorsements that he received from the newspapers. Here, says one lead story, he has made the railroad interest dig up another $50,000 in taxes. Surely his aggressiveness earned him a right to such coverage. After all, he's being called a leader here in the last line of this next clipping. But of course, a percentage of the railroad's $50,000 payment also went to him. But there was more to it than all of that. For George was the silent partner, half owner, of New Lexington's largest newspaper. He had learned from classmate Harry P. Wolff how the real game of politics had to be played. Soon he was on the Republican Party's State Central Committee, representing what was then the 11th Congressional District, and by 1910 we see from this headline that George T. Drake was being boomed for Congress. Here, too, the faction led by General Grosvenor was backing the young man whom the newspaper was now calling the live wire. He knew how to campaign and certainly knew how to get elected. An ardent campaigner, he relished making speeches and greeting constituents of every kind. This 1909 headline says that his plurality as auditor equaled that of Theodore Roosevelt 4 years earlier in the presidential election of 1904. What changed the direction of George Drake's political life was his sudden conversion to the Roman Catholic Church. Although a Methodist by background, though basically non-observant in practice, he had honored his wife's request that all of their children be educated in Catholic schools. This is the first grade class at St. Rose's Catholic School in New Lexington in 1906. In the foreground, seated in the middle in this enlarged portion of the group photograph, is little George, George T. Drake, Jr. He was 6 years old when this photograph was made. The next print was taken about 2 years later when the children made their first communion at St. Rose's Parish in New Lexington. In the detail, we will see young Adeline, who was then about 10 years old. Her presence is indicated by a pencil mark. On the other side of the group, the boys' side, near Father Cush, the pastor, partially blocked by others, stands George Drake, Jr. The man who changed the course of George Sr.'s life was this handsome Irish priest, Father Kearney. He had come to preach at a Sunday picnic sponsored by St. Rose's in New Lexington. Father Kearney was then visiting the Dominican Priory at St. Joseph's Church in nearby Somerset, Ohio. Throughout the outdoor sermon, George Drake had the eerie feeling that every word Father Carney was saying was meant directly for him and no one else in the audience. It resulted in a much talked about conversion, and out of respect for his privacy, George wanted his baptism to be private. But many years later, George Jr. would admit to sneaking into the church and hiding, just to see whether his father would have to remove the toupee before the baptismal water was poured over his forehead. It turned out that he didn't. By the time that the two George Drakes, son and father, were photographed on the occasion of the senior George's 40th birthday in 1911, he had already become a Catholic, effectively ending his political career. Whether his conversion was genuine or was merely an expedient way out of politics was known only to him. He decided to move the family to Columbus. His eldest son, Bill, wanted to go to the Ohio State University and afterward to enter the medical school there. And so it was that when Paul Goulding Drake, the last born of the Drake boys, sat for this photograph on his 10th birthday in 1922, the Drake family was now well ensconced in the capital city, Columbus, Ohio. Of the 5 Drake children who had survived from infancy into adulthood, it was William Francis, or Bill, who was the highest educated and professionally the most accomplished of his generation. Arguably, too, more than any of the other brothers, he had the most balanced perspective on life and the clearest sense of who he was and what he was meant to do with his life. The least photographed of the other Drakes, not many prints survive of Bill in early life. This photo shows him much as he was at the beginning of his medical schooling. He changed very little over the years, despite an early reliance upon glasses and the premature loss of most of his hair when he was only in his 20s. He would change very little from this 1932 photograph. His face is generally unlined, and from the size of his neck we can see that he was an athletic man, especially in his younger days, stocky, never overweight, tall, in fact with George Jr. the tallest of the brothers, both of them standing just under 6 feet. It was on June 10, 1925, that he married Sarah Ruth Gallen. The Gallens were a well-known, well-respected Catholic family in Somerset, Ohio. On one side, the family tree included the renowned Union general, Phil Sheridan. In the late 1940s, the general's niece, Nellie Sheridan, who became a well-regarded public official herself, was cared for at the Drakes' home in Columbus. Initially, Bill and Ruth set up housekeeping in New Lexington, where he was practicing medicine. By the late 1920s, however, they had moved to Columbus, where for most of his career he maintained an office at 2425 North High Street in Columbus's North End. In the next photograph, we see Bill standing on the far left, pictured with the Drake family in 1936 in the living room of 260 Oakland Park Avenue, the family home. Bill is 39 years old. Jim, standing next to him, is 29. Adeline, who loathed admitting her age until she was past 80, was 38 in this photo. Paul is 24, and George Jr. at the far right is 36. The last images we have of Dr. Bill Drake were taken in Sarasota, Florida in 1953. Because of uncontrollable high blood pressure, he was in failing health. He and Ruth had hoped that rest and relaxation in Florida would help him, but his brothers had to drive to Florida to bring him back. Later in that year, 1953, Bill would die at the age of 56.